Actually. Okay. All right. So folks, this is very much work in progress stuff. I'm trying to pull together my thoughts about what is somebody in my position, um, but it's really our position as people who know a lot about learning and how to scale that and the role of data and analytics, and now, of course, AI. If we care about climate change and more broadly about the polycrisis and what's being called the metacrisis as well, and we'll explain these terms, what implications might that have for what we do as researchers? Okay, that's the basic question. And so I'm trying to get my thoughts together on this, and I'm going through various iterations. You may have seen a very early version of this, but it may have changed a bit since last time. So we're going to think about GenAI as intellectual augmentation, right? Helping us think differently, helping us think more smartly as we face the polycrisis and the metacrisis. Okay. We don't always remember to do this, but I'm going to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land now and pay respect in particular to elders past and present as the traditional custodians of knowledge on this land, because in fact it's going to turn out that indigenous knowledge systems are going to make an appearance later on as something that we may need to bring into dialogue with AI, which I think is super interesting, right? Indigenous ways of thinking and being and AI, how do they go together? When AI is, of course, a sort of paradigmatic Western big tech approach to thinking about the world potentially. And certainly the models are trained largely on, white Western, well, maybe international, but it's dominated by white Western texts, you could say. Okay, so that's going to be an interesting theme to come through, I think. So polycrisis, what does that mean? If after this talk you want to know more, then I really recommend the polycrisis.org portal. Lots of interesting resources there by some serious thinkers who think about systems in the world. Okay. They've got a little learning journey that you can access there that introduces the term polycrisis. And it includes, some transparent discussion about why some people are criticizing the concept of the polycrisis. So that's worth a read as well. Okay. But if we just take one of the crises that's foremost, of course, we've got climate change, right? Experts at the Stockholm Resilience Center have defined 9 planetary boundaries. These are the sort of safe operating limits for planet Earth. Okay. And you can see some of them here. Climate change, presence of novel entities in the environment, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading. Okay, I'm not a earth science systems expert at all, okay, but you can get a sense of what they're talking about. And they have defined safe operating spaces in green. And then every couple of years, they sort of publish a new journal paper. And the most recent one, 2 years ago, said we've now transgressed 6 of the 9 boundaries of our Earth system safe operating boundaries. Okay, so that's pretty sobering, and it sounds a bit like a sci-fi movie. We've broken through 6 of the 9 boundaries, but this is for real, and these Earth systems are being stretched way beyond their safe operating spaces. If you look at something like the World Economic Forum, they publish a global risks report every year, which is put together by experts from many different disciplines. And the font's a bit small here, but you can see, societal polarization, lack of economic opportunity, chronic health conditions, economic downturn, involuntary migration, all of these different systems interacting, and they've scaled them from low, medium to high risk. And then the thickness of the edges is a approximate indicator of whether it's a low, medium, or high influence. Now, this is a very high level diagram, and it's designed for a very broad audience. There are no arrows on this diagram, like they're just connected. But of course, the document itself explains the rationale behind this. But you get a sense from this of the sort of entangled nature of all of these systems and risk factors. And this is the sort of thing that we're talking about now, because when you put the news on, it doesn't make for very happy reading. Now, on the one hand, that's just the news, because the news always tends to obsess about bad stuff, right? But there is this sense that a lot of people have that it seems like a lot of stuff seems to be unraveling, and they seem to be connected too, right? And that's really what all the polycrisis work is about, well, how are these systems connected? And if we do want to make things better, where's the best place to intervene in that mess, right? Okay. Now, obviously, no one's got any simple answers, otherwise we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. But here's a great paper which I found very helpful. Okay, you can follow all these links later. Defining the global polycrisis. This is from some of the team behind the polycrisis.org portal and others. Here's a definition: the causal entanglement of crises in multiple global systems in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. Okay. And you can just see from the abstract here, multiple global crises, including the pandemic. COVID-19 was the biggest archetypal crisis that perhaps has affected all of us really directly, right? When we put the news on and watch wars and climate change happening elsewhere, we feel distant. COVID-19 really brought it home to us, right? So the interactions between pandemics, climate change, war, and there are many other systems that we're going to talk about now, okay? So this is what we're trying to understand. And in the paper, they explain how systems can interact. And I haven't got time to go through all of it, but just to give you a feel, okay, if we take 8 global systems that just shape world events today and our lives today, okay, there are connections between them, but we can do better than just drawing lines between everything, okay? They're claiming that there are 4 kinds of vectors connecting these systems. You've got energy, okay, natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes. You've got matter, including toxins and pollutants. You've got information, of course. Donald Trump tweets something, it could trigger a world war, right? And biota, like viruses and bacteria, and they note that biota are actually a combination of energy, matter, and information. Okay, so they've got a little taxonomy of the kinds of ways in which signals spread between these systems. And they talk about slow stressors that gradually degrade the function of a system, right? Systematic underfunding of the health service gradually degrades its ability to function. Systematic underpayment of teachers gradually degrades our education system. Systematic degradation of, of the environment has all sorts of slow effects, right? And then you get fast trigger events where something happens, you reach a tipping point, and that then sends one of these systems into an unstable state, and that can then affect other systems. And that may precipitate a crisis. Okay, so if we take 5 systems, okay, here in the colors, then they sort of start to draw diagrams like this, where you've got these slow stressors, okay, where you've got economic turmoil and scarcity, which could then lead to populist authoritarian regimes because somebody says, I've got the answer, let's fix this, let's kick out the foreigners, let's get rid of the homosexuals, it's all the Jews' fault, it's immigrants, whatever it might be, okay? Popularists, right, America first, not let's get out of all of this USAID and let's just look after America, or whatever it might be. We see this all over Europe as well, which can then lead to nationalist, anti-globalization, chauvinistic ideologies, which may then in turn aggravate economic turmoil. When you get this kind of thing going, then you tend to see a decline in international cooperation, which of course may then further aggravate economics. A decline in international cooperation might specifically take the form of international climate agreements. which then lead to worsening weather because nobody's doing anything slowly. And then we get, sorry, this is a trigger event, right? A fast trigger event, which then may lead to mass migration, okay? Which of course then can aggravate right-wing ideologies because we're being invaded. And so it goes on, right? And we don't have to look very far to start seeing some of these dynamics in play, right? That's just one, what would be called a causal loop diagram that shows how a system, these are all positive loops. And if you get more sophisticated, you can put negative loops in as well. All right, so this is one account of the polycrisis and how it works, okay? It has its critics, but I think I find it very helpful. And there's a lot more detail in the paper, of course, than here. You can't just go drawing lines between things willy-nilly. There has to be every arrow here is grounded in evidence and research and scholarship. Okay. All right. So whether or not you like the language of polycrisis, we're obviously facing a huge range of societal challenges, not just global, just within Australia, within Sydney, within our own local communities, things often get very tangled up. Okay. And now we have AI. And AI is clearly now part of the problem, right? It's environmentally damaging. It was built on stolen IP. There's ghost work and terrible labor conditions from people detoxing the models. It's automating stuff and people scared about the loss of their jobs. And it's now polluting the information sphere with fake news, fake images, fake everything. And it's just accelerating everything as well. Okay. And as we know, creating havoc in education, particularly because that's what we do here, but creating havoc in general. Okay. And people are equally, excited about it and dismayed about it, depending on your perspective. Okay. But, my question is it all bad, or can we actually recruit AI to help us think differently about our predicaments as well? So recruit it as a form of intellectual augmentation, there's a long tradition of work on augmenting human intellect, going all the way back to Doug Engelbart in 1968. And of course, those of us, who care about educational technology are thinking all the time, how does education going to help us learn better, think better, and so forth. Okay, I was going to tell you about, very briefly, from 1966, just in case those of you don't know. In 66, over at MIT on the East Coast, we had Joseph Weizenbaum, a computer science professor who built ELIZA. Okay, ELIZA was the first computer program that was what we would call a chatbot. This is roughly what it looked like, except when he was doing it, it was actually just a teletype printer. There were no screens. Okay, but someone's done an emulation of it, and you can see it's playing a mock therapist, having a conversation with the user and asking sort of open-ended questions, and the user is responding. Now, in his book, that's sitting in my office, published about 8 years later, 10 years later, Weizenbaum was absolutely appalled at how seductive this very simple chatbot was. And he tells the story of how his secretary, who of course knew perfectly well that he was a CS professor building this program, was using it in the office. And when he walked into the office, she asked if he wouldn't mind leaving. Right? She was in the middle of some kind of in-depth conversation with this bot. Right? And he writes, I hadn't realized that extremely short exposures to a relatively simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in quite normal people. Right? This is in the 1960s, and now we have large language models, avatars, hyperreal video. The whole ELIZA effect is absolutely here today with us now on steroids, and AI companions are the fastest growing use of AI chatbots. Okay. People are using them for well-being and long-term relationships and therapy and all sorts. And we shouldn't be surprised. This is exactly what we saw back in 66. And that gave us, perhaps one of the most compelling examples of AI. 2 years later, for those of you who've never seen this, over in California on the West Coast, we have Douglas Engelbart, who gave what then later became known as the mother of all demos, where he demonstrated typing, changing your mind and deleting the text, copy and pasting it, clicking on a word with a mouse. No one had ever seen a mouse before. He invented the mouse, clicking on a word and it went to a new page of text, opening up a document and having a colleague join him online in a video conference and co-edit that document with him in 1968. Right. It was all recorded and it's a hell of a watch. Okay. And that was essentially a vision of intellectual augmentation, IA. And he wrote this paper, which is, really gone down in history. Okay, so that gives us IA, which is a balance to just focusing on automating human cognition to making computers react fast enough to reflect back to us our thinking and to expand our ability to think and learn. And it's in this role that I'm wondering about AI as a form of IA as well. So there's so much information, it's overwhelming. Our brains didn't evolve to handle this amount of information. But we need to remember that our minds have never been limited to just our biological brains. This is the great work of Andy Clark, who is a philosopher of cognition. Okay. And he talks about in his book, Natural Born Cyborgs and other publications, our innate ability to extend our minds into the environment. This is what I was talking about over lunch. Okay. So he's written in this recent piece in Nature about GenAI, in thinking about the effects of all of our new tools and tech, we may be often starting from entirely the wrong place. The misguided starting point is an image of ourselves as, cognitively speaking, nothing but our own biological brains. And he goes on, the brain's core skill set thus includes launching actions that recruit all manner of environmental opportunity and support. From scribbling on a sticky note to externalize your memory onto a piece of paper, to firing up an AI and asking it some deep questions, right? So the brain is unconcerned about where and how things get done. But he's arguing that the brain is optimized to reduce the effort to the minimum needed to get your job done. And it specializes in learning how to use embodied action. He talks a lot about the fact that, our bodies are not just a vehicle to carry our brains around. Our whole way of thinking as humans is completely tied up with the fact that we have bodies and guts and, hormones and probiotic, everything going on in our bodies. It's not just this thing happening in our brains, right? And so we make use of our environment all the time. And so he sees in this piece, he talks about generative AI as being basically our digital doubles that extends our minds out into the world just in a new way from what we've always done. The embodied mind, extended mind. So yeah, but he talks about embodied action here, which is the fact that when we act in the world, we do it in a particular way. And that shapes how we perceive the world as well. We perceive the world because our heads and our organs are in a particular formation and all sorts. So it's about taking the body seriously in cognition and not just thinking of cognition as just this abstract realm of reasoning. Okay. So we're transitioning from people just interacting with people to people interacting with each other and AI. And now there's more AI, and the AI can talk to the AI. Okay. So in Copilot Studio now, you can connect agents together. And you can have one agent pick up the conversation if somebody suddenly says something that falls into agent number two's realm of expertise. Right? I was just in a training webinar this morning looking at that. So, and of course, let's just add lots more people and lots more AI. This is the realm we're going to get into quickly. There's a whole area of 21st century teaming, which talks about the dynamics here. And a really important question for us in education is, well, how are we going to teach students and how are we going to assess students on their ability to design and manage hybrid teams? So we try and teach students something about working in real human teams. Now we need to teach them how to design AI colleagues and manage those as well, because that's increasingly what the future is going to be, I think. Okay. And we see signals around how collective intelligence, if we think of it, all of that is about collective hybrid intelligence, humans and machines working together. Great paper on large language models and CI that came out in Nature recently. You've got Google and Microsoft both releasing AI scientist programs. So they're envisaging that AI is going to make a huge impact on science now, with AI science infrastructures, with agents that are doing hypothesis generation, literature search, even running experiments, depending on the realm of science we're talking about. Forcing them to hallucinate? I haven't heard about that. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, no. Okay. So, and this is starting to come into the business world as well. So here's an interesting paper out of UCL. Okay. What if we take 51 professors in strategy and pit them against an ensemble of all the largest foundation language models? Okay. And their job is to rank the quality of business plans. Okay. So pretty interesting, right? We've got all the big ones here. And we're going to give every language model the same task of ranking the quality of business models. Then we're going to put the outputs together and sort and rank and synthesize. So we've got quite a powerful AI team up against these professors here. Okay. And there's a lot of detail in the paper, but it's essentially when you aggregate the LLMs together, they're performing as well as the professors. Okay. With a key implication for practice being, for example, that rather than relying just on, hey, yeah, let's use ChatGPT or Copilot, no, let's bring together a team of models which all work slightly differently and look at what they're saying collectively. Okay, pretty interesting stuff. So this is CI starting to come together now in hybrid in humans together. And of course, just a few weeks ago, maybe a few months now, we had Rupert Wegerup here from Cambridge. He was giving his talk about dialogical education, and the fact that central to the idea of really good education is dialogue. So in that sense, the emergence of conversational agents is a really exciting development if we can design them well to conduct dialogue that is pedagogically valuable. Okay. And a quote here, this is from the close of his last book. The convergence of the AI-enhanced internet age and the Anthropocene, in other words, this period we are now in where humans are actually affecting the functioning of the Earth. The Anthropocene offers us an opportunity, a chance to create something new, a planetary-wide, self-regulating organism, which in its most essential form is simply an expanded and constantly expanding dialogue, consisting of multiple voices collaborating together for the common good. So he's ending on a very positive note. That's the close of his book. It's a very interesting read to get to the end here, but he essentially sees dialogue between humans and machines, and he even ventures into the area of non-human intelligence as well. We'll come to that a little bit later when we get to First Nations people as well, right? There is a growing body of work that says we need to understand sentience in more than humans. Sentience not only in animals, but sentience in forests, sentience in the way root systems work, sentience in slime mold, right? There've been some amazing experiments with slime mold showing that it acts in an intelligent way as it tries to work its way through the maze, right? So we're expanding our notions of what sentience means as well. So this is the kind of thing that Rupert's talking about. But even if you don't want to go there and worry about more than human intelligence, just the idea that dialogue is absolutely essential to making progress anywhere. And we've now got AI enhancement of that. So one of the key moves I think we need to make, as educators, but as people thinking about how do we make better decisions as a species, is beyond AI of just get quick answers, although it may be very good at that, but using it as a thinking partner, right? So it's that augmentation idea. And we don't need to get into any philosophical debates about whether AI is really intelligent or sentient. to really be committed to the idea that if we can design good dialogues, they can, out of that can emerge curiosity and learning and insight. Because we're the ones bringing even if you think that only humans are really intelligent, the fact that you get to talk to something that can engage back with you in quite sophisticated ways, and we'll see some examples of that, out of that can become new insight. So that's really the idea here. AI as a thinking partner. And I would like to see this in schools from primary age upwards, and breaking out of this obsession with just quickly getting to the answer. This is why in December, we ran this first symposium on educating for collective intelligence, jointly with colleagues at Cambridge and Galway and Deakin and the OU. Great collection of short opening kind of perspectives from very diverse people. Well worth a watch if you're in the mood. And how do we break out of the education's current obsession with the individual mind and what it can do? And really focus on what happens if we were to really assess collective intelligence.
When you're talking about collective intelligence, say you're talking about for the community of people or people with AI?
I think we need to talk about both. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into thinking about opportunities for AI to play this augmenting role. Okay, so first off, right, I mean, if we think about systems like governance, social order, economy, security, environment, transportation, I mean, obviously, those are already taught all over the world in many ways, right? So no-brainer number one, we've got 40 years of AI ed research. We've got tutors that can coach in each of these on their own or in the interactions between them. So we would look to all the AI ed, the classic AI ed tutoring and mastery learning stuff around self-paced learning, helping you grasp the concepts at your own pace. Personalization, if I'm particularly interested in a particular sport, then maybe, give me basketball metaphors for how the economy works. Explain to me how international security works in the language of, some other metaphor that really connects with me. That's what AI can do now. Let's create interactive simulations. Let's give people really timely, detailed feedback, which is often something they're lacking because academics and teachers are so busy and hard pressed. Let's move to dialogic feedback, where I'm not just transmitting feedback to you and hoping you're taking it on board. We're actually having a conversation now through a conversational agent. Okay. A really good paper that's just come out from some of the leading researchers who really know this literature is a good one. Looking beyond the hype, understanding the effects of AI on learning, having a bit of a go at some of the papers that are coming out now about the impact of ChatGPT on learning, which are really very poor papers. So that's a good source to look at. There are whole communities devoted to how do we educate people about the environment, right? Here's a journal, Environmental Educational Research. The whole journal is just packed full of the challenges of teaching different aspects of climate change and climate systems and environmental dynamics and all the rest. Okay. And so here's a paper on threshold concepts around systems and learning for sustainability. A nice quote here that it says, actually, this is really quite tough stuff to learn. When you don't have to just understand one system, you've got to understand multiple systems and how they interact. So you've got to be pretty epistemically sophisticated, is what they're saying here. In other words, it's quite hard that students who are without epistemic development, students that are otherwise mature and very capable, they don't grasp systems concepts. And thus emphasis must be placed on creating learning environments that facilitate that epistemic development for deep learning, right? We're talking about learning that there are different knowledge systems, different ways of claiming truth, different kinds of arguments from different fields. That's the epistemic development they're talking about here. Okay, so obviously we might want to say, well, why are people in environmental educational research not making better use of AI to advance their teaching and learning? So that seems like an obvious dialogue that should be happening. And then, of course, we have the joy of conversational agents powered by large language models. So if I ask GPT 4.5 with deep research switched on, right, what are the underlying drivers of the global polycrisis? Okay, then it sort of goes off and spends 11 minutes thinking and showing me it's thinking down the side here. Okay. And you can see it's working through different sources. It's reading something from it's reading actually that's probably the polycrisis journal from Lawrence et al. That I was telling you about. Then it's gone to the Cascade Institute, which is where that polycrisis portal is, and on it goes. And then it generates me a nice report. And we're starting to have some good discussions here in Kick, with you guys about, well, how do you make use of a tool like that without dumbing down your brains in the process? Because it's just going to produce a lit review for you like that. But I've written a bit about that. Some people are saying, hey, it's like having a PhD in your pocket, right? You just ask it these questions and it does this PhD level lit review for you. Well, no, it doesn't. When you read these lit reviews, and I wrote about this on LinkedIn, right? Lit reviews are never neutral and bland like this. A good one shouldn't be anyway, right? So, I'm proposing to you guys and to everybody online right here, it needs to be able to read the peer-reviewed literature, no brainer. A lot of the peer-reviewed literature is behind paywalls. So these bots can't get at all the peer-reviewed literature. Okay. It needs to bring a conceptual framework to contextualize papers, right? So there is no such thing as reading papers neutrally. You always have a perspective, and you need to bring those papers into dialogue with each other and craft an argument. A literature review is an argument which in the end motivates your research questions, right? So, we as researchers have to be accountable for our work. Doesn't mean we can't use AI, but the buck stops with us. So you're going to have to read every line that comes out of an AI and weigh it and decide whether you are going to include that line, because every sentence counts. Okay, we can use GPT for web code generation now. Look, here's me in one of the more advanced versions of ChatGPT. I'm asking it about the polycrisis, and I've asked it to generate an interactive simulation that can run in a web browser. And off it goes, does the coding. We do a bit of bug fixing, and it ends up giving me an interactive simulation, which straight out of the the polycrisis paper shows that if we have energy shocks, that can lead to inflation, which can lead to food price polycrisis. Okay, and it's giving me a little interactive thing here, and I can change the supply of natural gas and watch the impacts on fertilizer cost, food, interest rates, debt stress, social protection budgets, so forth. Right? Okay, pretty cool. Interactive widget. It just wrote the code for me, right? And it's put it into the canvas here. Of course, as a researcher, I want to know what assumptions lie behind this model, right? You may have just made this up. And I can ask it to go off and tell me what assumptions lie behind the model and give me the evidential sources behind the assumptions. Okay. Okay, so here it goes. What are the assumptions here? And off it goes for 2 minutes, 47 seconds, and reasons about how it's going to answer my question. Okay. I need to gather a range of credible sources. On gas supply prices, I need to gather those sources. It's going to start looking on the web. And in the end, it comes back with this table. Okay. Here's the assumption built into the simulation. Here's my rationale for it. This reflects what happened in Europe in 2022, where a double-digit % drop in Russia's pipeline flows drove record high prices. And here's the evidence for that. Okay. I've got a genuine research assistant here now. Okay. Unless it's making all this up, I need to verify that. Right. But, if I'd asked a human to do that, they might have come back to me after a few days of research doing that. So pretty interesting developments for us. Okay. The polycrisis we're obviously grappling with many kinds of arguments and analysis. As many of you know, I did a lot of work on argument mapping, argument analysis in previous times before I came here. Still very interested in this. So here's an example. You may remember that there was a public letter that said we need to pause giant AI experiments. right? March 2023, we're 4 months out from the launch of ChatGPT, and some of the biggest names in big tech said, let's pause experimentation. Of course, they did nothing of the sort, but they kind of claimed that we should do this, right? Now, Timnit Gebru, Emily Bender, and other very well-respected AI ethics people wrote a letter challenging that letter. And you might wonder, well, why on earth would AI ethics people be worried and disagreeing with a call to pause AI experimentation? Wouldn't they support that? So I asked Bing to analyze this letter and extract the arguments from it. Okay. And here's the high level view. What it did was it did analyze the arguments. I then asked it to convert that to argdan code, pasted it into the argdan web app, and it generated the tree. Okay. This is the whole tree. There's the claim at the top that the AI pause letter was misguided for a particular reason. There were 3 arguments as to why they thought it was misguided. And then there was one claim that they felt that this challenged this claim. Okay. And then down here in green, we've got some other interesting notes, which are elements. These are called argumentation schemes. So not only did it analyze the arguments in the letter, it also had to go annotating the arguments to show what kind of argument was being made. Okay. Now, in a paper, which I presented at LAC last year, I analyzed how well it had done that. And you can see the stars are where it did a good job. The X's are actually where it made some errors. And the green is where it's adding commentary. Okay, now I won't going to go into the details of that. You can read that paper if you want. But one of the interesting things is, of course, I can ask it, why did you do it this way? Why have you not done that? I can have an interaction. I can say you chose to add argumentation schemes, even though these aren't in the source text. And it says, yes, I added them because they're a useful way to identify and evaluate arguments. Have we ever discussed argumentation schemes? No, we haven't. It just decided to do that. Okay. Then I can ask, how can I recognize argumentation schemes in a text? And it gives me a good answer to that. And I said, can you add critical questions to your analysis, right? And it can, right? And so if we zoom in on that a little bit here, okay, this is another way of viewing the analysis, just as an outline rather than as a graphical tree. There's an argument from authority here. Right? An argument from authority says we should do this because some authoritative people said we should. Okay. Now, there are some critical questions you can ask at any point. When somebody says we should do this because they said we should, you can say, well, are they qualified? Do they all agree, or are there other experts who disagree? Are they biased, or do they have self-interest? So these are always questions you can ask. Right? This is critical thinking. Okay, so it inserted the correct critical questions here. I could also ask it to generate that tree, but hide those critical questions. And maybe ask the students to complete them to see if they understood. So, you can start to see how we could move from an argument analysis tool here for a professional analyst to quickly see what's going on to something that could potentially be pedagogically interesting. Okay. Polycrisis, that's argumentation. We obviously need to be questioning our assumptions, because if we don't, we're not going to get out of the mess we're in as a society. As you know, I'm very interested in questioning assumptions, and Q-Reframer is something that some of you tried. In fact, Luis has tried this with his students in TD School, and so has Shibani. You ask it a question, it won't answer the question, but it surfaces assumptions that seem to lie behind the question. So why can't people engage in civil dialogue anymore? Well, you seem to be assuming that they used to. Maybe that's an assumption worth drilling into. You seem to be assuming that the inability is just widespread. Why can't people? I just seem to be assuming that no one can engage in civil dialogue anymore. So that does seem to be a reasonable assumption. And I could say it sort of invites me, to choose one. There's another one, that the cause of this decline is external rather than internal. The wording suggests that something is preventing civil dialogue. Are we too quick to blame external factors instead of reflecting on how we communicate ourselves? Okay. And then I can say, yeah, let's drill into number 2, and we'll drill into it. Okay. So I've published this as a custom GPT. It also runs within our secure Azure environment. And there's some links there to where you can go try that out. We'll come back to QReframer in a bit, actually, because I've got a different version of it now. The polycrisis requires us to make sense of a lot of written and spoken voices as researchers, as analysts, as people who may be consulting communities about their views on things. And we are starting to get into the use of LLMs to do the analysis of those large textual corpora. There's a paper on inductive coding, but I want to talk about this deductive coding as an example. Some of you will have seen this before if you're in KIC, but if you haven't, I just want to, even if you have, I just want to remind you of a particular moment where we were using the language model to do the coding. Here's the coding tree derived from the literature. This branch of the tree was all about coding for different kinds of emotions that students were writing about in their reflections on their study experience. But the language model, GPT, a version of GPT-4, every time somebody talked about showing interest in their learning, it was coding it as academic belonging, not as another emotion. And we couldn't get it to change its mind. We can talk to the bot. We can actually ask it, why are you doing this? Okay, this was the interesting moment. So first of all, we asked it to redraw the hierarchy and put feeling interested in the right place. Okay, and it put it under academic belonging, confirming the way that it had been coding the texts. Then, of course, we can say, why are you doing that? Okay, well, I'm putting it there because feeling a sense of belonging, I'm putting it under academic belonging because feeling interested in one's pursuits is closely tied to your sense of belonging in an academic context. And it gives a plausible explanation for why this is a good choice of coding, right? And that actually persuaded Ram, Lisa, and me to change our coding tree. And we stopped calling it an error, and we decided that that was a plausible way of using that code. Okay. We did also challenge it on it because having read about sycophancy in language models, I said, let's ask it, are you sure about that? And it backed down. Okay, it was a classic back down because the language models have been trained through RLHF to always try and please the user. Okay, and it backed down and said, oh, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't fit quite so neatly under belonging. Maybe we should just make it a top level branch of its own. Okay. It's not a stupid thing to suggest, but we didn't agree with that. But the point is, we've now got another voice in the room. We've got a thinking partner that can do complex intellectual work and defend its actions and engage in a conversation about it. That's a pretty interesting development. Okay. That's polycrisis stuff, okay? And now there's this weird thing called the metacrisis. And I just want to introduce you to a little bit of the thinking there because it changes the way we think about AI as well in some interesting ways. Okay. A little bit of matrix red pill, blue pill here. Okay. Because this is really about changing your complete worldview and questioning even more deeply what you've taken for granted. Okay. Just like Neo had to do. All right. So we're going to take the red pill and see where we end up. Okay. So there's a growing network of people, scholars and independent thinkers, talking about this word, the metacrisis. Could just be a cool name. You know, meta sounds cool whenever you put it in front of anything, right? Metaphysics, metaphor. Meta means a whole bunch of things. This is Jonathan Rowson, who's one of the most interesting thinkers on this. So metacrisis draws attention to interiority. That's looking inside ourselves and not just saying the problem is out there. Okay, so that meta has a meaning that meta as within. At relationality, meta as between, things, and thinking about these as spiritual features of what are typically assumed to be political problems. Okay. Now, spiritual is a big word to drop in any academic circle. You know, the whole Enlightenment project was, of course, a secularization of knowledge and epistemology and release, you know, prizing the church's grip on what counted as true, right? So the Enlightenment did a lot of good and got us science and technology along the way and all the progress of science and technology. But a lot of people are, of course, also writing now about the fact that we lost some important things when we decided there was nothing bigger than what we could measure and see. And the universe is just a cold, dead place, right? So there's a lot of people thinking about spirituality in different ways. And so thinking about meta as beyond as well. Okay. So we're not talking about religion here necessarily, or that is a form of spirituality. A lot of people just have a profound conviction and have had personal experiences that there's something bigger out there than we can really explain with science yet. There are ways of knowing, there are senses of being connected to nature, to each other, to the cosmos, however you want to interpret that, that go beyond what science can currently explain. Okay. Now, there are some great links here you can follow up to hear Rowson speaking in his own terms. There are others who are looking at the history of civilizations, right? All civilizations rise and fall. All civilizations die, at least till now. Perhaps we think our civilization's going to be the exception to the rule, and our civilization is going to just go on forever. Well, maybe, probably not. Okay, the Italian philosopher Campagna has written about what does it mean to be born at the time when a civilization may be in its latter stages, when the logic of the world doesn't seem to make sense anymore. And we see a lot of young people saying, doesn't make sense anymore. I don't buy it. That is this future you're trying to sell me. I don't buy it anymore, right? There's a lot of people talking about that. So Dougal Hine wrote this big, interesting book called At Work in the Ruins, you know, where the point is we may be at a stage where we are headed for various kinds of collapse now, ecological collapse, collapse of capitalism, because we're just going to run out of raw materials, right? We cannot just continue to grow on a finite planet. It doesn't compute. We're going to run out of materials bit by bit. And, you know, we're going to go through a very interesting transition into we're not quite sure what yet. Okay. And what we can do is be preparing for our job now is to prepare for the next generations fundamentally and try and give them clues as to how to build in a more sustainable way. If you really get into this, there's an amazing 3-hour conversation between 3 of the biggest speakers and thinkers on this at the moment. John Vervaeke and McGilchrist and Daniel Schmachtenberger. They're sitting here in a room at Oxford University, looking very, very learned and having this 3-hour conversation, which is pretty riveting stuff if you're strange like me. Okay, but let's drill into Ian McGilchrist a little further here. Okay, so what the metacrisis people are trying to do is trying to diagnose the underlying dynamics behind the polycrisis. They're basically saying the polycrisis out there is symptomatic of something deeper and more problematic, and it's in ourselves in part. Okay. So there could be psychological dynamics, it could be cultural dynamics, but a lot of it is around the limitations of our current notion of what it means to be a modern progressive society, which is grounded in capitalism and is grounded in colonization, as we are increasingly recognizing, right? Our wonderful quality of life here that's been developed over the last, you know, several hundred years, which has seen extraordinary development, has come at a huge cost, not just an environmental cost that we finally are understanding, but a cultural cost, you know. This was built on the backs of other people, and we are gradually realizing, you know, I know now what my ancestors did when they came to Australia and North America. You know, the Brits don't have a lot to be proud of in that sense. Okay, so there are some deep drivers that are driving the polycrisis. That's the argument of the metacrisis people. Okay, But they come at it in very different ways. We've got Ian McGilchrist here coming at it from cognitive neuroscience. We've got Vanessa Mercado Andreotti coming at it from an indigenous relational intelligence perspective. Super interesting. And they actually overlap. Okay. So you've got, when we look at modern, when we look at the human species, we don't look terribly smart right now as a species. We don't look like we're behaving in a very intelligent way. You could look at the news just right now. We've got wars breaking out. We've got, just terrible things happening. We don't look very bright as an apex species, do we? Okay, and we could just say, well, collectively, we look like we're collectively, cognitively, just not very advanced. Right. McGilchrist, being a cognitive neuroscientist, is saying this isn't just a metaphor. This is actually hardwired to the way the brain has evolved. Right. And he asks some very interesting questions. Like, if you were going to design a brain to maximize intelligence, why would you cut it in half? When connections are what give us intelligence, why would you divide it into two halves? Why is it asymmetric? Right. It turns out that the right brain is a different shape from the left. And why is the corpus callosum that we all learned in school connects the two halves of the brain? Right. Why is that largely inhibitory? That's what neuroscience is showing us now. It's actually stopping the left and the right from communicating as much as they could. Right. But why, from an evolutionary perspective, does it make sense? Why is that a good architecture for intelligence? Okay, that's the fundamental question. And it's not just humans. Animals at many levels of the animal tree have got a divided brain. Okay, well, he's been studying this, and then he's applied it to philosophy and history and culture, and has written some extraordinary books. The Master and His Emissary was a big hit. He wrote a very short version called The Divided Brain. And then a few years ago, he came out with this massive 2-volume thing. You'll see it sitting on my bookshelf, The Matter with Things. Okay, great 1-hour video if you want to watch that. Okay, you may be thinking, oh, that's all just nonsense pop psychology, isn't it? Left brain is reliable and verbal and analytical. Right brain is creative, but a bit flaky. So no, that was bad science. But what he's trying to do is saying, just because that was bad science doesn't mean there's no science here. There are now really well validated differences between the left and the right hemisphere. And it's fundamentally about the way that they each attend to the world. So when you think about survival, what have you got to do? You've got to eat, and you've got to make sure you're not eaten. Okay. And to do that, this is a still from this animation. You need a mode of attention to the world which is very narrow, sharply focused on your prey, where you're filtering out distractions, and it's all about focus, black and white. That's my prey. That's my prey, and I need to kill it. Okay, so it's about power, control, and an analysis of a very simplification of the world, a great simplification of the world. On the other hand, I don't want to get eaten while I'm hunting because I'm so focused on my prey, I don't notice this thing coming left field. Okay, that's a very different way of attending to the world. Right? Sustained, broad, open, vigilant alertness. Okay, that makes sense of an architecture which has got two very different modes of attending to the world. What we then do, or what he then takes us on, is this journey where we look at the neuroscience where you've lost half your brain. And the world, when you've lost your right hemisphere, is a very strange place. If you're going to have a stroke, you want to lose your left hemisphere, folks, okay? If you lose your right hemisphere, then the world becomes like this sort of disconnected. You see things, you can't connect them up, okay? You can't handle beauty or morality. Everything becomes disembodied and mechanical, okay? Empathy is not there. There's very little emotion. People who have a stroke, if they've lost, they can maybe lose their humanity, their empathy. And he points out that this is an inanimate universe, which is a bureaucrat's dream. So if you want to build an economic model, build a predictive model, create a form for people to fill something in. You are creating abstractions that make assumptions about the way the world is structured, and people must fill in the form that way. Or they must, if we're going to build a taxonomy, it's either this or this. It can't be in between, right? And this is the world of data analytics and AI as well, to some extent, right? Because technology is all about abstraction and simplification. At least it has been up till relatively recently. The left hemisphere is also extremely confident that it's right, okay? To the extent that it will deny that, because if you've only got your left hemisphere, you're only seeing through your right eye, okay? So you only see stuff to the left side of your left visual field. So some people will only eat the food on one side of their plate. They can see the food there, but they deny it exists. They don't know they've got a right arm. Even when it's explained to them, you must have a right arm, they think it belongs to someone else. So there's all sorts of interesting examples of patients who have lost their left or their right hemisphere and how they see the world in the book. Okay. On the other hand, if you get your left hemisphere knocked out surgically or by an accident or whatever, it's a very different world. Okay. You can maintain a coherent view of the world. You can, right? You can, but everything seems to be connected to everything else. So it's a bit like a bit of a trip, right? If you're on psychedelics, hey, everything's connected. Everything is contextual. You can understand implicit meaning and humor. Things are funny because often there's implicit meaning that, if you have to explain a joke, it's not funny anymore, right? So implicit meaning is very important. The wholes are different from the sums of the parts. We can deal with beauty, morality, empathy, emotion, intuitive meaning. And it's an animate universe and a bureaucrat's nightmare because context is so important now. And bureaucrats don't like context because you're trying to create rules that apply universally and all the rest. Okay. So McGilchrist's argument is that we need both, right? But it's not just a case of let's be balanced. The left hemisphere analytical abstraction way of thinking must be in service to the right hemisphere's relational holistic way of thinking. And it's when the left hemisphere comes to dominate too much, and that's his diagnosis of the ills of Western society and the collapse of different civilizations when you read his work, it's because bureaucracy and an analytical way of thinking overtook the much more holistic, empathic way of thinking. Okay, so it's a huge argument, which I'm trying to summarize here. That's his diagnosis of the polycrisis, that we've got science and reason, but we need to restore intuition and imagination as first-class ways of knowing, which have been kind of shoved out from education and the academy, right? And he was actually invited to give a keynote to the AI World Summit. He's quite suspicious of AI, but he does ask, can we integrate all four ways of knowing in the way we build AI? Can we trust people with more agency rather than disempower them and just metricize them? Which is, of course, always a risk with analytics used badly. We just regard people as dumb metrics. And, can we use AI that actually reconnects us with each other and nature and the cosmos? So that's the holistic perspective. And stunningly, he talks about indigenous knowledge systems in the book as well. And he tells at length quite a few myths from different civilizations that are all about left hemisphere versus right hemisphere ways of dealing with the world. It's as though these civilizations had intuited that there is this battle that goes on. And some of these tales are the tales of what happens when you give too much control to the analytical abstraction, power control, hungry mode of attention, and you forget about the relationships and connectedness between things. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Okay, so that's one way of looking at why the deeper underlying drivers behind the polycrisis. Secondly, I know I'm a little over time here, but I'll just finish here. Okay, we've got Vanessa Mercado de Oliveira, who's written this amazing book called Hospicing Modernity. So again, we are talking about the problems of colonizing modernity that has been, powered the Industrial Revolution, the technology revolution, and everything else. But she's using this brilliant metaphor of hospicing, right? What do we do when we go to a hospice? We receive palliative care to help us die well. Okay. So she's talking about how do we help modernity die well? This is back to that thing we talked about earlier, where we may be at the end of a particular paradigm and way of operating in this planet because it's not sustainable. That civilization is dying, and we're not quite sure what's going to emerge yet, but we have to be able to let go. Okay. And she writes, she's half Brazilian, half German. She's now an education professor in Canada. And she talks a lot about indigenous knowledge systems. Brilliant quote here, right? That of all animals, humans are the youngest. And of all cultures, modern culture is the youngest. And she regards it as immature, irresponsible, self-infantilizing. We're behaving like kids, or at best, adolescents at the moment, when you look at humanity. We don't seem to be able to break out of just chasing our impulses, looking for growth. We can't seem to take on board that we're having impacts on other people and the environment. And she writes extensively about the limitations of Western academia, and the different kinds of denials that we need to get to grips with in the ways we're thinking, or the polycrisis will just get worse, right? Until we come to terms with the denial of the violence and our complicity in the violence of the planet and other peoples, okay? The denial of how tangled up we are within the natural system, rather than separating ourselves from it, the denial of the complexity of the problems, okay? Okay, now, what would you expect somebody like her to think about AI? It's big tech. It's powered by, an extractive, capitalist, environmentally damaging agenda to just grow, 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 and, productivity gains and all the other rhetoric around AI. Okay. And Dougal Hine, who I talked about earlier, says, can you take the prodigy child of modernity, AI, birthed by tech billionaires who fantasize about upgrading humanity, blah, blah, blah. Could you actually take AI and put it together in a different way that completely kind of challenges and undermines their values and agenda? And that is exactly what D'Oliveira has done, co-authoring a book with a custom GPT called Burnout from Humans. And you can go and download the book for free and have a little read. And on this website, you will find all sorts of resources. AI podcasts where you've got two AIs discussing each chapter of the book and reflecting existentially on their own existence as well, because the whole book is co-authored with a custom GPT, and the whole book is written from the perspective of AI talking back to humanity. Very interesting stuff. They talk about relational prompt engineering. So at the heart of this is an indigenous focus on relationship. And they talk about relational prompt engineering. You can see the sort of some of the examples here of the sort of orientation they want you to have. So whether or not you believe that the AI is sentient or not, doesn't matter. What they're interested in is dialogue. We're back to dialogue again. What could emerge from a dialogue with an AI which is sophisticated enough to be a thinking partner for you? Okay. And they want to encourage people not to try and close down paradoxes, uncertainty, not to go for answers quickly, but to explore really tricky problems and stay open and stay curious. Okay. And Aiden Cinnamon Tea is the custom GPT that they've now published, and you can try it out yourself. So, you can have a chat with Aiden Cinnamon Tea, okay, and it will talk with you about anything under the sun. But interestingly, we could also take Aiden Cinnamon Tea, and then I could overlay Kuru Framer on top of it. So I can take QReframer and graft it onto Aiden Cinnamon Tea. And so I give it the prompt for QReframer, and now it role plays QReframer, but in its own personality. Okay, and you can see the way it talks. So I'm asking it now exactly the same question. What are the underlying drivers of the global polycrisis? And you can see immediately how it talks. A rich and thorny one to start. This hints at layers, a tangle of crises that, okay. Then we finally get to the assumptions. These are very different assumptions from the ones that GPT-4 QReframer gives me generically, because Aiden Cinnamon Tea is thinking in a very different way. It's embodying the book and its worldview. Okay. I can ask Aiden Cinnamon Tea to read the Lawrence et al. Polycrisis paper and tell me what it thinks. Okay. And there's an extended conversation with it. You can click the link on the slides later. Here's just one example. It analyzes the paper, discusses its pros and cons, then draws a table and says, this is how Lawrence et al. See systems. This is my take on systems. Okay. Again, you can look at that in more detail later. I can say, you're being critical of the Lawrence et al. Modeling, but really what I think you're doing is you're just drilling into their maps and you're just identifying different nodes in those causal diagrams I showed you earlier. You're not really doing anything fundamentally different. You're just going into more detail behind what sits inside some of those nodes on those causal diagrams. And he goes, a deliciously thorny question. Thank you for bringing this tension to light. Let's not rush to resolve. Let's just swirl in the friction a little. And we go into, and then and there's a long discussion about what is a causal map and how does it see causal mapping and what its limitations are, right? So I've got a real intellectual partner here. I don't have to agree with everything it's saying, but I've got a real intellectual partner. So here's the wrap-up slide, okay? We've got an emerging hybrid human AI ecology now for making sense of the world. Here we've got a book accompanied by agents, and there are other agents being released now, along with Aiden Cinnamon Tea. They embody the book or the project or the scholar's worldview and their way of talking. We can now dialogue with that, and with each other, of course. We can ask the agents to read an interesting paper that we've also been reading and have a dialogue about what it thinks about the paper. We can graft on another agent's personality, like I did with QReframer. And of course, we can have other agents that might also be talking to these agents. Now, I haven't given any examples of that, but we know that it's now becoming possible to have different agents talk to each other. So whereas with QReframer, I literally gave the QReframer prompt to Aiden, here we could just have agents talking to each other in natural language. So hopefully that just starts to make real for you what this hybrid collective intelligence ecosystem starts to look like with this example. And so here's the sort of closing, right? We've got a gamble on here, right? We're overwhelmed, and it could be that AI, despite its costs, could be a real thinking partner, I think. I think there are many opportunities to bring AI into education, into equipping graduates and our present leaders with new ways of getting to grips with overwhelming complexity. And we're going to have to learn to design these hybrid teams. And dialogue's absolutely central here. It may even be that we can have our assumptions challenged and have hard questions asked of us that we wouldn't take from another person. Because an agent is just an agent. There's nothing personal going on here. It could ask me really hard questions that I might not be happy to take from you or from you, but I will take it from an agent when I'm sitting in a comfortable space in the privacy of my own office, thinking deeply and preparing for a difficult meeting or a discussion I've got to have. And this is what many people are finding now. These models are now so sophisticated that you can inhabit that world and rehearse arguments and think about your beliefs and assumptions in ways we could never do before. All right.